morning to everybody. It's a great pleasure and also honor to be here and share a session also in honor of Gervase, who I met the first time 2004, I think, a while ago. And I see him with all the dynamics and intellectual, how to say, intensity which he has been here also for yesterday. It was a wonderful day yesterday. And what we do, we start with structures and continuities. So I'm very pleased to start to introduce people. It actually explores how scholars and images negotiate distance across time, from animal allegories of war and peace, to nostalgia and the politics of historical vision. It asks how art history can transform the gap between past and present into a site of reflection rather than rupture. Well, now I'm very happy, and it's very great that I can introduce the first speaker, who is Maria Loh. Maria Loh is professor of art history at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. Previously, she had taught at the Hunter College in New York and at University College London. She's author of 3 books. Titian Remains, The Partition and the Transformation of Early Modern Italian Art in 2007, Still Life's Last Desire is a Portrait of the Old Master, 2015, and all very well-known books, Titian's Touch, Art, Magic, and Philosophy in 2019. And I'm also informed that she met Gervase when she was a junior research fellow at St. Hilda's in Oxford over 2 decades ago. It's more or less the same time we met first. Well, that's it. So please, deliver your talk about cats and dogs. Okay.
Okay, so first of all, I'm very grateful to Constanza, Lia, and Elena for the invitation to participate in what has been a joyous and intellectually stimulating celebration. And so when I started thinking about how my contribution might best highlight Gervase's scholarship, I found myself returning to his book on his anthology on towns in medieval England, as well as his fascination with how images work. And this is a theme he's developed in many of his publications, but also in Spectacular Miracles, which he co-wrote with Jane. And thinking about this reminded me of I'll get that to you now, an early 16th century woodcut that I had seen many years ago in the British Museum of a city under siege. So the iconography of war, as well as the visual and material culture of the battlefield, have been much studied. But the print that I will focus on this morning, I hope you agree, is rather extraordinary. This frayed woodcut, currently in the British Museum collection, measures 269 by 367 millimeters, or just slightly larger than a big laptop. I have myself not found any other imprints, but that does not mean that they did not exist or do not still exist somewhere. I haven't managed to find them, but for the most part, the very nature of the reproductive print medium would have ensured that there would have been more than just this one that should have survived. Both the maker and the date of this print are unknown, so all we have to go on really is what we see before our eyes on this orphaned sheet. The subject matter is identified by an inscription that runs along the top, like a breaking news banner. La sedia crudele fatto da sorzi, which is silent for mice, topo. And then the next words are missing, but I think it would have read, I just put that back up again. I don't know why it disappeared. Collegati ai cani contra I gatti. The cruel siege waged by the mice allied with the dogs against the cats. Now, of course, I can't say for certain because those words have disappeared, but collegati and contra I gatti is such a nice poetic couplet that it has a certain formal logic in its pairing. Now, the museum suggests a possible relation between their woodcut and a short mock epic printed by Giovanni Andrea Vavassore in the first half of the 16th century that bore the title La Grande Battaglia dei Gatti e dei Sorti, a text possibly by Folengo or someone from his circle, but I'm not so interested in that attribution. This might appear as nothing more than a small parodic text, but there were in fact multiple editions in circulation, attesting to its sustained and widespread popularity. La Gran Battaglia recounts the story of Gattone, the grotesque emperor of Battaglia, who ruled with corruption and arrogance. Beneath him were 10 feline underlings who possessed even more ridiculous names like Gatazzo, who was the monarch of Caesarea, and Gattino, my favorite, who was the ruler of the Isola di Niente. So these tales about imperial overreach and violent retribution sound like they might foreshadow Orwell's Animal Farm by some centuries. They were themselves also derivations from an earlier tradition of the Katiomuomachia, a 12th century Byzantine drama attributed to Theodoros Prodromos, which in turn draws its inspiration from the Galeomuomachia, which is a contest between weasels and mice, sometimes attributed to the 1st century CE fabulous Phaedrus. And that, in turn, may have come from the 1st century BCE pseudo-Homeric Batrachomuomachia. This later tale was itself an expansion of an Aesopic fable involving a frog that offers a mouse a ride across a pond. You know, this is a theme I think we all know. But then who drowns his companion by accident and is subsequently himself devoured by a bird who flies off the 2 creatures in its beak. So this is in Aesop's fables. So why were such beast epics, as they're known as, so popular? Well, for one, the Batrachomuomachia featured a cast of marvelous characters with names in Greek that might translate into puff face, right? So that's obviously a frog. Crumb thief, my favorite, Sir Croaks-a-Lot, ham nibbler, cabbage treader, and so on. For another, these short mock epics in Greek were used for centuries in schools as translation exercises. And one can understand the pedagogic appeal of this parodic mode to a classroom of boys, and they were all boys. However, this noble trans-historical literary DNA is only partially legitimate, for none of these would-be ancestors mentions dogs. Moreover, the Renaissance descendants tend to portray the mice as the besieged figures inside the fortified city and the cats as the besiegers outside in the field. Furthermore, Gattone, crowned, enthroned with spectre in hand and surrounded by his minions, is clearly fashioned as a tyrant, at once shitty and powerful. I apologize for my coarse language so early in the morning, but the original phrase is okay, so there is no emperor to be found in the London print. The figure in the bastion here with the feathered helmet might be the leader, but his stoic expression seems only to register the crushing defeat that is about to befall his garrison. In short, while there is a family resemblance between the multiple texts I mentioned and our print, there is no direct relationship. So how do we get beyond this impasse? So I've mapped out this complex literary tradition this morning so as to highlight more clearly how the woodcut in London strays from the texts, to remind us that an image need not always be a mere appendage to some yet to be discovered text somewhere. An image, in fact, can be its own efficient and moving creature that solicits a different kind of interpretive attention and a different kind of activation. So let's zoom into the image and have a closer look at some of the details. As you will see, throughout the battlescape, smaller inscriptions provide further details about what's going on here. On the left, we see the pitched tent of the Murine Legion. Murine, if you're interested, is the adjective for mass. It's one of the best things I learned. A group of mice with their weapons raised, what is known as a pike block, prepares for battle. In the background, in the background, mice scuttle back and forth. A shadowy silhouette here carries to buckets of water. A black mouse converses with a white mouse, and another black mouse seems to be warming his hands or his paws before a fire. 2 dogs have been hung as traitors, and here and there you can see the occasional mouse crawling on all fours. This, of course, invoked in my mind one of my favorite Orwellian slogans: 4 legs good, 2 legs bad. Can I just see by a show of hands, how many of you have not read Animal Farm yet? And I know everyone's going to be petrified not to raise their hand, but I am curious. Okay, just say good. Thank you for your bravery. You just need one person to start. Well, for those, okay, see, there it comes. For those of you who haven't, it's really short. It is Orwell light. It's the gateway drug into 1984, and I would highly, highly recommend that you all read it. It's such a wonderful parable. So there's a section where the animals are all chanting 4 legs good, 2 legs bad. But by the end of the tale, as the pigs betray their fellow animal comrades, it suddenly becomes 4 legs good, 2 legs better. And this is a very early example of the way authoritarians co-opt language. Okay, I'll circle back to Orwell later, because his ghost kind of haunts my experience of this 16th century print, confirming that certain themes, such as war, elide the confident methods of the strict historicist, as well as the insistent anachronist. Let's stick with our image. So between the encampments of mice on the left and the fortress of cats on the right, another inscription on the ground tells us that the mice intend to storm the fortress with fury. Vano in furia is that little bit there. Above the words, a tight-knit band of black and white mice bearing swords and carrying poles and scaling ladders charges towards the stronghold on the right. It looks to me as if the mice have been carefully studying Valtorio's De Re Militari, which was published throughout the 15th century in Latin and also in Italian. I don't know which edition they read. Okay, their offensive is boosted by 2 more messages in front of them. The first appearing beneath a cannon that announces that the mice plan their final strike. As our eyes rush from left to right, we also encounter these 2 mice here who are blowing, one of whom is blowing a trumpet. Now, in the Renaissance warfare, the protocol is you blow your trumpet or perhaps use drums to signal to those in the fortress that you want them to send out an envoy to negotiate the terms of surrender. And this was done to minimize looting and other forms of violent retribution, which became more common after Charles VIII's incursion at the beginning of the Italian Wars in 1494. The interaction of word and image makes the eventuality clear, even to the non-literary viewer. The spectator's attention moves rapidly from left to right, from the reserve army to the fast and furious mouse militia, to the cannon, to the trumpet. And then the artist has cleverly placed the message, qui I sorti per la trombetta dimanda la fortezza, as if it were being blown out of the trumpet itself. And the word dimanda, right here, seems to stretch out towards the fortress, so that as viewers, our gaze breaches the fortress walls as we read or look, or both, from left to right. And this sense of inevitability in the upper third of the print is then amplified in the central register, where the mice charge forth with swords, pikes, and crossbows, fortified by their canine allies who possess advanced military gear, including helmets, 3-pronged lancers, and arquebuses or guns. The diagonal torrent that surges forth across the composition drags our eyes further down along with the cats. Some look back in anger, some look back in sorrow. One tries to shield himself in vain. At the very front, we see a cat in profile crossing the bridge. And from this perspective, he looks like the front end of a battering ram, used to smash open actual gates in sieges. Of course, some of you will protest, but a battering ram is a ram by its very nature and etymology, ariete. Yes, but in Valtorio, we find all kinds of zoopomorphic examples, and scholars such as Christina Thermo have also noted that there was this strange tradition that occurred, at least in the battle of the siege of Florence at the beginning of the Italian wars, where the soldiers inside the fortress, I think you can all just make out the cat, they would put out a female cat on a lance to taunt the soldiers outside who operated the large siege machine that it was known as gatto. So, you know, to lure the boys into the fortress. We won't go there, locker room banter. But surveying the field, 3 factions can be identified by their flags. The cats by fish, the dogs by bones, and in the background, the mice seem to have an oval shape on their banners. And if we follow the logic of iconography, this must be a breadcrumb or perhaps even a roll. While there's virtually no information on this print, Silvia Urbini has proposed the tantalizing theory that prints such as this one may have been used as visual aids for public singers of news and stories known as cantastorie. It would help explain the rather large dimensions of the woodcut and the use of the text to kind of break up the narrative into smaller episodes that can then be expanded through live narration, much like we've been doing now. And parenthetically, I would like to gesture, but this is just a speculation, that it might have been destined for a tavern or somewhere near a tavern, because strangely enough, there is one figure in the prints that is identified by profession. It took me a long time to decipher that word, but it does refer to a vivandiero, which is Venetian dialect for a woman who sells food or provisions to soldiers, and also more generically as a food server. Okay, so if we are guided from left to right by the internal inscriptions, we are also brought from the background to the foreground, where the final act of this war is taking place. Here we see the victorious commander of the dog regiment, who delivers the summons to surrender or the articles of capitulation to a cat envoy. And there's so much delicious humor and irony in the detail that our anonymous artist has added to the celebratory armor of the general, who wears upon his head a burgonet with the face of an animal on the visor. There is one in the Fitzwilliam Museum, for instance, that features a ferocious lion head on the front. There are many examples such as this one. So the acrobatic imagination of our unknown printmaker of this little print is exceptional, and the woodcut is a highly self-aware invention that quotes, inverts, and deliberately misreads the visual and literary culture of its time, whilst also invoking forms and traditions of the past. In that sense, it is just like a mock epic, but in visual forms. But unlike its classicizing antecedents, something different is also happening here, for the woodcut speaks out in insistent contemporary terms. Upon first glance, it would seem that the alliance between the dogs and the cats is what clinched the battle. The alliance between the mice and the dogs is what clinched the battle against the cats, and this is certainly true. But the true heroes of the siege are the 3 cannons in the lower left-hand corner. The first on the left has just fired, and we can see the round shot being propelled through the cloud of fire and smoke. The 2 piles of cannonballs lie in waiting on the ground, while a soldier rolls a powder keg towards the 3rd cannon that is being lit by an artillery mouse with a long linstock. Now, military historians have underscored how 16th century warfare was distinguished by the increased use of artillery, which could affect devastating damage, rendering medieval defense systems obsolete. The Fortezza dei Gatti, I think I have to go out now. The Forte, oh no, sorry. we'll come back to that, we'll stick with this. The Fortezza dei Gatti, that is in the larger print that we'll return to in a moment, has been depicted with crenellated walls atop a simple sloping defense wall. It lacks the military sophistication of the artillery fortresses of the later 16th century, known as Terrasse Italienne, which had been designed with angled bastions and multiple masonry curtains, precisely to sustain the battering force of gunpowder-assisted weapons. The new regime of Renaissance weapons of mass destruction also accounted for the drastic increase in casualties moving into the 16th century, when medical technology just could not keep up with military technology. And indeed, if we look at the central heap here, it would seem that the artillery mice in the corner have knocked out a squadron of cats as if they were mere bowling pins. And the violence of that blast is felt in the details. Amidst the broken weapons, a horrific gash opens up on the back of a faceless creature. Another cat here stretches its paw outward in desperation, but is unable to hold back the torrent of dogs that surge forth from the left and will soon trample all the fallen bodies and corpses further into the uneven terrain. However, if we look closely at this heap, we'll also notice that there are two figures with long snouts, underscoring the multi-species nature of the victims. The sight here is piteous, regardless of where the spectator's sympathies might have sat. It invokes the kind of illustrations that accompanied popular accounts of actual historical sieges and sacks. Here, for instance, we see the title page of an anonymous poetic lament on the sack of Rome from the 1530s. In both, the artist has depicted the battlefield with tents on one side and the fortress on the other, and in both we confront the sightless visage of a decapitated head lying on the ground, underscoring in no uncertain terms the traumatic bloodlust of war. Writing about the cruelty of the French forces in the early decades of the Italian wars, Francesco Guicciardini lamented that the violence was, quote, a thing unheard of and very frightening in Italy, which for a long time had been used to seeing wars staged with beautiful pomp and display, not unlike spectacles, rather than waged with bloodshed and dangers, end quote. There is a general sense among 16th century commentators that old rules of engagement had fallen apart. When the city of Prato fell to Spanish forces in 1512, the invading soldiers leapt over the city walls, quote, like mad dogs, cani arrabbiati, and subjected the inhabitants to their grandissima furia. So if real-life soldiers had become beasts, here the fictional beasts have taken on human traits. And this, in a sense, brings us back to Orwell. In 1940, commenting on the moral empathy embodied in the novels of Charles Dickens, Orwell remarked, and I quote, "The thing that frightens me about the modern intelligentsia is their inability to see that human society must be based on common decency, whatever the political and economic forms may be." So unlike the artists who illustrated the 16th century mock epic, La Gran Battaglia degli Gatti Sorci, unlike them with their clear hierarchy of winners and losers, the pathos which marks our unknown print has depicted the victims of war as equal victims, has depicted the cats and dogs and mice as equal victims of war, making it clear that divisive internecine conflict is always a zero-sum game, whether between frog and mouse, mouse and cat, or cat and dog, etc. The personification of contrasto, or discord, is portrayed by Cesare Ripa as a hissing cat about to square off with a growling dog beneath a young soldier who has drawn his sword, readied for combat. While Ripa dedicated 4 entire pages to his description of the personification, he did not provide an illustration in the 1603 edition. Nevertheless, in one passage, he notes that she is sometimes shown with a lion and a lamb lying in peaceful coexistence at her feet. And so this brings me to my final point. In closing, a final word, or rather a final apology about my title. Cats and dogs living in harmony refers to a state of chaos when the natural order of things has become inverted. It comes from that well-known classic, Ghostbusters. However, when I rewatched the scene in preparation for this talk, I realized with great annoyance that I had misremembered the title, the line, which merely describes dogs and cats living together. The original formulation, living together, suggests a coexistence with minimal friction, a state of mutual tolerance. It lacks the utopian spirit and Trinitarian ethos implicit in the word harmony, which some optimistic part of my unconscious clearly interjected in the place of the actual words. So how does one redeem, well, how do I redeem myself here? I offer you peace. So let me end with this sketch, this etching by Giuseppe Maria Mitelli. In 1698, shortly after the Battle of Zenta, at the end of another disastrous, ruinous war between the Ottoman Empire and the Holy League, Mitelli made this charming allegorical print of peace and happiness joined together. The inscription above them reads, "Pace, pace, non più guerra, allegrezza in cielo e terra." In the background, we can see the Ottoman forces literally being chased out of the picture. And all around we see expressions of joy. On the right here, in the foreground, two men in French and Spanish costume dance together. And next to them, in the lower edge, we find a dog, a cat, and a mouse creating harmony with their trumpets. So if I spoke at length this morning about war, I end here with peace as we move from the bare minimum of dogs and cats living together to the dream of cats and dogs living together in harmony. So the strict historicist would want to pinpoint exactly which war is being allegorized here in the London woodcut, while the insistent anachronist would say, who cares? War is war. A third way here is possible. Even without the broad suggested dating of 1530 to 1560 that the British Museum offers, even without that, we could have safely concluded that this print emerges from the devastation of the Italian wars. The imperial connotation of the cats from the iconographical tradition that preceded it might align the feline camp with the Habsburgs, but then we would have to figure out who all the other characters are. Some part of me can't help but wonder whether the black and white mice might not be the ideological descendants of the black and white Guelphs who have finally gone together, banded, and are fighting off the imperial cats. But here I'm sliding rapidly into fantasy, so I won't push the point any further. And in any case, I can see I'm out of time. Thank you.
Yeah, we are ready to introduce Heiko Droste, who is Professor of Urban History at the Institute of Urban History and the Department of History at Stockholm University. His latest publications concern the Baroque news market, includes the business of news, April 2021, as well as the Baroque historian's confession, reflections on the Baroque economy, came out in Lund in 2021. So please, Heiko Droste, we are looking forward to listening to this. Okay, we are also generously back in time.
Okay, thank you so much for having me here. It's an awful lot of fun. Although I am a historian, and it's very interesting to hear art historians think. So I will try to understand, make you understand how historians think about a subject that is somehow in between art history and history, which is nostalgia. And I was supposed to start with a bit of music. You will have a handout containing the English translation of a poem by Walter von der Vogelweide, early 13th century. So if you read the first quote while you listen to the German text sung by a Dutch singer-songwriter, Herman van Veen, in the early 1980s. So I will stop it here. It's too long for this session. I only have 20 minutes. It's a poem by Walter von der Vogelweide, the most renowned German poet in the 13th century. And I heard that poem in the early 1980s when it was sung by Hermann von Veen, who put it into modern German. It touched me emotionally, made me long for the past which I could not understand, at least as I myself at that time was longing in the different direction, away from home, leaving school, the tiny home village, looking for new places, a new life, studying history. However, it touched me then, it still touches me. I turned out to become a medieval historian. How can we historians understand Walter's longing in 1230, separated from us by several deep historical ruptures? Longing is probably a universal human emotion and experience. This longing is today often interpreted as nostalgia, although Walter could not have known the term. Still, we can diagnose Walter with nostalgia. Is the question of whether nostalgia existed in the Middle Ages meaningful in itself? For whom? I will try to answer these questions by approaching them as your regular historicist historian. Historicism is the prevailing form of academic history writing. Today, there are others. Historicism is based on the study of a past that is past, finished, which is why historians have no possibility to experience the past. It is only to be found in an archive. Historians create analytical terms in order to write representations of a history they have no immediate access to. I have been practicing this form of academic history writing now for more than 40 years. It made me. As a historicist, I start by studying the history of the term nostalgia. It was created in 1688 as a medical diagnosis for Swiss soldiers. They longed home so intensively that it threatened their life. This diagnosis was based on a galenic understanding of the body and its fluids. The term was taken up immediately and changed its meaning ever since. At its core, it emphasizes an emotional longing backwards. In the 18th century, nostalgia changed focus from the place of longing for home to a time to long for childhood, well aware that that time will never come back. There was Immanuel Kant who made that change. As such, the term was used and discussed before it during the 19th century slowly sank into the mire of historical terms with little significance for the contemporaries. My favorite definition of today's understanding of the term is from Svetlana Boym. Boym was a cultural scholar who has written a marvelous book about nostalgia. Boym defines nostalgia as, quote number 2 on your paper, longing for a home that no longer exists or has never existed. Nostalgia is a sentiment of loss and displacement, but it is also a romance with one's own fantasies. This definition seems to fit nicely as an analytical term for Walter's longing for the place and time of his childhood. My representation of Walter's poem could be phrased in almost science-like categories, as I myself as a historian have no part in Walter's life. He's dead. Every other historian could redo my study with the help of the methods and sources described in my paper. Or so we want to believe it, because historicism works just fine for us. However, it has some serious flaws, which is why Hayden White, some decades ago, called the average historicist historian out for being naive, quote number 3 on your paper. History is perhaps the conservative discipline par excellence. Since the middle of the 19th century, most historians have affected a kind of willful methodological naivety. William Faulkner phrased the problem of the historicist assumption in one readily quotable line, quote number 4, the past is not dead, it is not even past. What is more, we would not be interested in the past if it was dead. Researching Walter's longing, therefore, asks for a triangulation in time. 1, there's Walter at the end of his life in 1230. 2, there is a Swiss doctor, Johannes Hofer, who in 1688 invented a fake Greek neologism using Homer's Ulysses. 3, there is me as a historian living in some kind of modernity who applies a pre-modern term in its modern interpretation on a medieval poem. All in all, it's like shooting on a running target while driving on a bumpy road, looking back in order to diagnose distance, hoping to bridge the distance. The goal is to diagnose Walter with being nostalgic in a way that I can make you understand. Well, let's start by talking about academic history in 2025. Today's interest in nostalgia is part of a fundamental change in academic history starting in the 1960s and 1970s. At that time, historians got uneasy about a past that did not disappear. The memory turn acknowledged that history, even academic history, is about that which can be remembered. These memories are of interest because individuals, as well as social groups and societies, act with reference to their memories of the past. They relate to this past, refer to it, research it in order to draw lessons, and define their own time by creating representations of the past. At that point, nostalgia resurfaced. Many academic historians were reluctant to accept the challenge of the memory turn, and still are today. They felt safer at a distance, looking back at what was gone. Memories were deemed unreliable compared to archival sources. They could be tampered with, misused by politicians. Nostalgia was described as a particularly unreliable memory, a sentimental longing without trustworthiness. Academic historians wrote devastating verdicts. You find them as Code 5. Nostalgia is to memory as kitsch is to art. Nostalgia is essentially history without guilt. Heritage is something that suffuses us with pride rather than shame. The nostalgic person merely is an incurable sentimentalist afraid of the future and afraid to face the truth about the past. We could easily find 20 more of these. Academic history should not long back. Instead, our discipline is coeval with modernity, claiming that history evolves through recurrent crises, eventually leading to an ever brighter future, rationality, progress. This future is not only better, it is open. Modernity is a promise. However, in the long run, the memory turn questioned modernity itself, turning it into history. Historical traumas like the Holocaust, colonialism and post-colonialism, environmental crisis, and the experience that the end of the Cold War did not initiate the end of history unsettled the guilt. This change in academic historians' perception of their own time, which we no longer have a name for, entailed a growing interest in collective memories, cultural heritage, and not least nostalgia. The number of publications on nostalgia is by now beyond any single historian's comprehension. And that is only the field of history. There are other fields interested in nostalgia. Cultural heritage has been turned into an industry. The above-mentioned Svetlana Boym described nostalgia not only as a form of longing for a past that most likely never existed and that we cannot go back to, ever. She has also interpreted nostalgia as an answer to the experience of a time regime, modernity, that fails to convince. Quote number 6. In a broader sense, nostalgia is a rebellion against the modern idea of time, the time of history and progress. The nostalgic desires to turn history into private or collective mythology, to revisit time-like space, refusing to surrender to the irreversibility of time that plagues the human condition. Today's interest in nostalgia as a critique of our own time is not only a good explanation for the topic's vitality. The past is important because it is a part of our identity as historians. Since the demise of modernity, we are living in an eternal presence, however, still using history in order to create meaning, trying to root ourselves in time. Which is why the answer to my first question is no, we cannot. As your regular historian, I think we cannot talk about Walter's nostalgia. The term simply is not an analytical term. Most research do not even define it, they feel it. However, the longing, even if universally human, has to be understood with reference to a time regime and its expressions, because we need to understand Walter's perception of his own time. Not only did Walter not know the concept of nostalgia, although the terms history and future existed, they were understood in completely different ways. We can thus diagnose Walter with nostalgia for sure, but then we talk about ourselves, our own perception of time. Well, that is my first answer. There's another one. Nostalgia is an emotion and a form of historical experience. However, as I said before, the usual historian perceives the past as something that is past and needs to be reconstructed in order to become meaningful. There cannot be anything like an experience of the past. Historians don't use the term experience. The absence of that experience helps us achieving our goal of scholarly objectivity. Enter Frank Ankersmit, another Dutch, leading expert for the philosophy of history. He believes that emotions and experience might offer a deeper or by different access to history than your average historicist analysis. Ankersmit is positive about historicism, defends it, but he's also unhappy about it, as it limits our access to the past. In 1994, he claimed that nostalgia offered a way out of this mess. That is quote number 7. It will be my thesis then that nostalgia and the nostalgic remembrance of the past give us the most intense and the most authentic experience of the past. Ankersmit aimed at introducing experience into the historicist toolbox. He felt that it was missing. He also felt that Hayden White was correct in criticizing historians for being naive. In 1994, however, Ankersmit could not combine historicism and the historian's personal experience of the past in a meaningful way. However, he came back to the topic several times, the last time 20 years later. In 2012, Ankersmit starts off by distinguishing collective and individual memories. Collective memories appear at some point in history when a society goes through a dramatic shift that makes people turn around and perceive the past as something distinctly different, separated from the present. This event is collectively experienced and constitutes a disruption, like the conquest of Italy in 1494 or the French Revolution. During these disruptions, professional history takes its start, for example, with Niccolò Machiavelli and Jules Michelet. The individual memory is explained differently, and that is the one he's interested in. Contrary to collective memories that have to be understood by all, the individual memory can be compared to the work of an artist. The artist is meant to express himself based on his very own experiences, but without the need to be literally understood by all. The artist expresses experience in a personal way. That is the very point of art. Both forms of historical memories are thus meaningful, but work very differently. Collective historical experiences regularly aim at restoring a past, a building, a piece of art, like Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel or the Cathedral of Cologne. However, a restoration is more of a reinvention. Individual nostalgia is different. It is not about a reenactment of the past. It does not pretend to rebuild some more or less truthful memory. Instead, it is alerting us to a distance in time which the nostalgic can ponder about, thinking of alternative roads to go. At this point, Ankersmit introduces Johan Huizinga, another Dutch, with his famous study on the autumn of the Middle Ages. According to Huizinga, there are events and insights in history that simply do come to us as a surprise. Huizinga calls it for a sensation, and it was already mentioned in the first day. There can be a chronicle, an engraving, a line from an old song that seems unassuming and less important, part of the background of stable social structures. But somehow it is disruptive. It is a disruptive experience that makes contact possible. We perceive something special, an entrance into a different world which feels authentic and true. The experience of a sensation can thrust us from a horizontal into a vertical axis, connecting past and present by making us feel the distance and the difference. This experience might be understood as a special presence of the past, a revelation. Nostalgia as an emotion offers an experience beyond the archive material, an emotional access that offers an insight that goes deeper. That is, I think, what happened when I listened to Walter in the early 1980s. Huizinga did what Boehm and Ankersmit asked for in order to make this individual nostalgia work. He turned his insights into art, literature, which is why the book has been critiqued rather incessantly. Even Boehm turned his results on the use of nostalgia in post-Soviet cities into art exhibitions. She saw nostalgia as a way to rethink modernity, to turn the experience of a rupture in time that nostalgia is an expression for, into creating alternative ideas about history, which might form the basis for a new future. One calls this her off-modern, quote number 8. Off-modern is a detour in the unexplored potentials of the modern project. To sum up, historians stick to the illusion of a historicist analysis of time that are past, although many of us are fully aware about that being an illusion. However, the illusion works just fine because it entails an advanced apparatus of theoretical and methodological analysis of times that are progressing, times that follow a distinct order despite occasional disruptions and crises. We work on medieval history despite the fact that something like the medieval times obviously never existed. We also pretend that the clock went in about the same direction then. In that way, we usually ignore possible sensations in the archives. We also ignore the experience that time worked differently, was perceived and measured differently. I'm certainly nostalgic about the poem by Walter von der Vogelweide. It made me aware about a distance in time, a long distance, which still could be breached. But that is my understanding of nostalgia, not his. I'm emotional about a medieval history due to its authority, otherness. As your regular historicist historian, however, I have so far been unable to turn this sensation into written history. I'm not an artist. Ask me how I feel about it.